You are listening to The Vincast, Australia's #1 wine podcast, hosted by myself, James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. If you're a recent listener of the podcast, then you may be aware that there are 90 plus episodes that have already been recorded and released. You can find them all on my website, intrepidwino.com, under the Vincast section. If you are a recent listener, I really would appreciate you heading to the iTunes page for the Vincast and leaving a 5-star rating and a review to let me know that you are a listener and what you enjoy about the show. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. On episode 96 of the Vincast, I chat with fellow podcaster, food writer and blogger Lee Tran Lam from The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and we are so close to that magical number 100 episodes of the podcast, which is very exciting, and I really hope that my plans will come to fruition. I'll have an incredible guest for that very special episode. But if you weren't aware, there actually is a really wonderful community around food and wine podcasts in Australia, and if you don't listen to them already, there are a number that I actually really recommend listening to. The Mitchin is one, Ingridopedia is one that I've only just recently discovered, but my guest for this episode is actually the host of pretty much the equivalent of the Vincast, but for food, for chefs and food writers, that kind of thing. And her name is Lee Tran Lam, and for I think longer than I've been doing my podcast, she has hosted The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry podcast, where she chats with different chefs and food writers and profiles them and finds out what makes them tick and what their inspirations might be. So I thought, what an opportunity to actually have her come on this podcast and chat about her background and what inspires her. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Stick around till the end of the episode so you can find out how to get in touch with Lee Tran and myself if you did enjoy it. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Lee Tran, thank you so much for joining me today via Skype to be on the Vincast, and you're calling in from Sydney. How's the weather today?
We've been very lucky. We're getting that fake summer back. We had this fake summer for all of May, and then we had this crazy storm that ripped through. I think Tassie was also affected by those horrible floods, and then we got the fake summer back. So
Wow.
Hurrah!
It's like an Indian summer.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, yeah, I mean, we had a bit of rain, but nothing is certainly not as devastating as what happened further up on the east coast and then in the northern parts of Tasmania. It's pretty scary. So I hope anyone listening who is from those areas that you're safe and there has been minimal damage to your abodes. But Lee Tran, normally I would ask my guest if there was a moment or an incident in their life that really made them think differently about wine, that they wanted to follow a career path. But I guess probably it'd be more appropriate for you to ask, do you remember when it was that you kind of started to think about food in a different way, that it was something that really enriched and you know, inspired you?
You know what? It's interesting because there's a slight overlap with the food and wine. And what I remember is I had this meal at Bentley Restaurant, which was then in Surrey Hills in Sydney. And it was maybe one of the first degustations I'd ever been to, maybe like the second or third. And there was a wine tasting. And I had never really sat through a wine tasting before. And we just had this amazing sommelier who, you know, some people just kind of like show you the bottle and tell you the name of the vineyard and say what kind of grape variety it is. But he told a story with every single wine that he brought over, like it's from this part of Germany, it's from this part of France, and gave you a kind of postcard snap of that particular wine. So by the end of the dinner, it felt like you'd been around the world via, I can't remember, 8 or 10 wine glasses. So that was one aspect of that dinner. And the other aspect was I had never really had food like this before. I'd been to a few degustations, but it felt like you were in the school principal's office where, oh my God, am I, slouching? Or you kind of felt like kids who had snuck into a really grown-up party that you shouldn't be at. Like, I think the attitudes were slightly more stuffier back then in terms of what was, in quotation marks, fine dining. Whereas at Bentley, it was like so professional, but really casual and accessible. They had on music. It didn't feel like if you stood up, you might break something that was really expensive. And the food, Brent Savage had this menu that was so inventive and full of dimension and dazzle and flavor and texture. So you'd have a spoonful of a dessert. And I can still remember about, 8 or 9 years later where you'd get like the fizz of mandarin and then some white chocolate popping in your mouth and, chocolate soil or whatnot. So I remember just thinking, I didn't realize this is what dinner out could be like. And I wanted to blaze that in my memory bank forever. So that's actually what inspired me to start a food blog about, coming up to 9 years ago. So I started this food blog called The Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry because I thought, why not document this stuff rather than have it just kind of fade away in your memory? But also, I remember at the time I had a lot of friends who were moving overseas because they thought New York was more exciting or London was more exciting. And I thought, why not appreciate and enjoy what you have in your own city instead of pining for like, New York has this cool bar or Paris has this amazing patisserie? Because I think a lot of the time we don't realize how many incredible things are in corners we've never explored in our own hometown.
Yeah, but having said that, I think that it's quite easy to maybe be complacent or take what we have for granted. If you go overseas and you actually experience eating and drinking in different parts of the world and kind of appreciate what they have, you might come home like I did and go, now I really understand what makes our style of doing things so special and so unique. And I think particularly when you're looking at, if you, for example, go to a restaurant where the chef has a very strong Asian influence in his cooking, or French, Italian, Spanish, South American, whatever it might be, if you've been to those places, you kind of go, I can see what they're trying to achieve in terms of celebrating what makes food from that part of the world so special, but it's their own unique take on it.
Yeah, I agree with that because the last time I went on a trip across quite a few cities, and I ate at 11 Madison Park in New York, and I ate at these places like, Qua in San Francisco, and it cost so much money. It took me a while to pay that off. And then I came back to Sydney. I thought, you know what, Sydney has an amazing dining scene. There was nothing that I tried in New York or Paris or, San Francisco where I thought, it sucks. We just aren't at this level. I thought anything in Sydney is up on that same level, sometimes even better.
Right.
But circling back to that period, which was around late 2007, I think it was a very particular moment in Sydney kind of dining and bar culture because we started to get the very first small bar licenses because before then it was so hard to open a small wine bar. So there was a change in licensing laws. But also there was a change in many things, like a few years into that, you started to get, I would say, kind of the David Chang effect of no longer fine dining being seen as a be and all of what good food could be. And a lot of young chefs like your Dan Hongs and your Mitch Ors and people who had worked at those hatted restaurants setting up their own place and not wanting to do a French degustation that costs nearly $200. You know, they want to do fried chicken or, you know, street food or something that's a little junk food like, but still really fun and done with a lot of technical skill.
They wanted to make it accessible, and I guess,
yes,
you know, that kind of cool factor, but also make it aspirational in terms of it being really high quality sourcing of ingredients and, you know, great expressions of flavors and textures, but just make it in that atmosphere that was, I guess, more agreeable to sort of a younger kind of market.
Yeah, like you could go somewhere and they'll play, you know, Notorious B.I.G. and then, you know, serve you this amazing dessert done with so much technical skill, but you don't, you know, you haven't had to read some French culinary textbook to understand it. It just tastes delicious. And also I think something changed in the behavior of people dining out. I remember there was a period where everyone I knew would just go to the same Italian restaurant that I thought was kind of just average. And there was a shift, and I would say probably like social media, blogging, the kind of press that was coming out at the time. Like there was just a bigger proliferation of websites covering food, kind of made it more of a social thing to go, hey, let's try somewhere new. Let's try this place that's just open. Let's try this bar. What about this? Almost like when a new song comes out on the radio and you say to your friend, hey, have you heard this? Or, hey, so-and-so's released an album, have you heard it? It just became more of a conversational part of people's lives rather than this thing that you save for 3 months so you can go on your birthday or for your boyfriend's birthday.
Do you think that time in particular, it wasn't necessarily just about, oh, these chefs are doing something different, but it was also, oh, look, communication has changed. You know, there's not just reviews coming out in the weekend newspapers or annual restaurant guides, but there's, you know, food bloggers, and social media was sort of starting up at that time. And then, obviously, from the wine perspective, I know that quite a few of my former guests have talked about that time with great affection because they were able to drink wines from parts of the world, from overseas, that were quite different to what had classically been imported into Australia, and it totally changed their perception. As winemakers in particular, they kind of realized, oh, look, you know, we can do things a little bit differently to get a different expression of wine. Do you think that it was important that all those things were, you know, working at the same time to change the scene a little bit?
Yeah, I definitely agree, because before, if you looked at it, it was very led by traditional print media where you would be reading a review that, you know, was maybe filed 2 weeks ago and the restaurant probably opened 2 weeks ago or months before that. Whereas at that time, say, like, so let's take 2007 as an example. Someone opens a restaurant, you see it tweeted that night or that weekend, or you see that Miffy Rigby's tweeted about it, Patent Nurses tweeted about it. And then the speed of which things were happening was so much faster than that 2-week lag for the printed review in the traditional press.
Do you think that's why it's so important now that restaurants are doing so much more before they even open? Like they're having sort of bloggers come in, or they're doing their soft openings because they need to get that discussion going even before they open, rather than we open, the traditional media come in, they review, you know, several weeks or maybe a couple of months later, and that brings people in?
I think so. And even, you know, there's been a big debate over, like, should restaurants be reviewed the second they open? Shouldn't it be more of an American style model where a place can be open for 5 months and then it gets reviewed by, you know, someone like Pete Wells in the New York Times? But in Australia, there does seem to be quite a race to have the first review, have it reviewed as soon as it's opened. And I know because of that, I've talked to chefs and they say, we have to have so many soft launches beforehand because we have to get it right. Because we know as soon as we open, there's no grace period. People are out with their, you know, their red pens ready to assess us. So we
all the
really
Instagrams and
yeah.
and their TripAdvisors.
Yeah, totally. So there's no kind of ability to be anonymous for about a month and go, oh, okay, we nailed it. Let's now tell everyone about it.
Do you think that there's also a little bit of pressure as far as costs? Because, Sydney, Melbourne, rents are very high, wages are very high, food costs, wine costs, they all add up. So if you're not getting people in right away and really filling the restaurant, every shift, it can be challenging to sort of wait around for people to eventually come in. And once you're settled in and you've got the machine well oiled, that you have great reviews coming out.
I think so. I mean, what's the statistic? Something like the profit margin on a restaurant can be what 5%, and you can make as much money just putting money in a bank and not doing anything with it, rather than spend so many hours of your life sweating and cleaning and trying to get a restaurant up
Well,
and
I was
running.
thinking about investing in a restaurant, but maybe I'll just leave my money in my internet savings account.
Well, doesn't David Chang say it's better to just take a bundle of cash and just literally light it on fire rather than spend it on opening a restaurant?
I think he'd rather spend it on sneakers, though, wouldn't he?
Yeah, maybe. Also,
Almost the same thing, some might say.
I also wonder, when you hear of some of these restaurants, they're in the DA process for so long and they get held up because of council or building issues.
Licensing, yeah.
So that, by the time they open, they really have to make money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things where if you come out early on and say, oh yeah, we're going to be open by this date, so often you might actually hit that kind of opening window. You might have to push it back. And so I think a lot of people now are sort of saying it's going to be opening sometime, that they're not going to actually, put their reputation on this date.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you can name certain restaurants that have been talked about for so long and they kept getting held back, often not because of their fault, but because of, building issues or council or, I interviewed the guys from Three Blue Ducks for Good Food, and they're taking over this space in Rosebery, which Kitchen by Mike McInerney used to be in. And originally they just wanted to move in straight away and set it up as a proper restaurant, but they're running it as a pop-up for about 5 months. And the reason is they signed the lease, and in between them signing the lease and deciding, okay, let's, start fixing up a few things, the building got heritage listed. And it was like in a matter of weeks that actually happened. So it's really affected what they can physically do to the building. So they're just going to run this more casual style pop-up in the space as it is pretty much now. Before, but they seem happy with what they've got right now. But I think it's kind of, probably not hilarious for them.
I think that really it's a really fantastic thing that there is such a thing as a pop-up. I think it is a lot easier to kind of work in that kind of model where you maybe don't have the full kitchen. You might have to be a little bit more creative as far as how you're actually preparing dishes, but you can actually turn out something, get people interested, and actually get a bit of cash flow.
Yeah, and I think I was talking to one of the chefs there, and he kind of liked having a few of those limitations, and you kind of have to be more creative, and that can be a very interesting process.
Yeah. So going right back to that really inspirational experience at Bentley, who I believe just celebrated their 10th year.
Yeah, that's right. I went to a 10th birthday dinner on Monday.
I did see that menu. It looked very, very good. What were you actually doing at that point?
Okay, so it's kind of funny. There's always been this ongoing journalists versus bloggers debate, which I think is so funny. But so I started out as an editorial assistant in 2003. So I've just always worked as a journalist in editorial. I guess hilariously, my degree was in print media, which is funny because no one would graduate with that now because it wouldn't be worth anything at all.
Would anyone even take that?
No,
course?
like it was a print media degree to differentiate between doing radio or film. But
okay.
now it would not, because it would be worth nothing doing a print media degree. Because we all know about the state of print media. So
it'll never die, but it'll just become more and more niche, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was an interview with the writer Gay Talese on a podcast called Longform, and he said that journalism's going to be a bit like acting, where you're going to have another job to do it. Like you might have to be a waiter and also just write.
Or like, I think, what was that movie? It was a Kevin Smith movie, and not Brad Pitt, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon are having a conversation about, first you have to do the commercially successful film that, you get $15 million from, and then you do the artistic sort of art house film afterwards.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who do very corporate copywriting gigs, and then they might be able to freelance on some articles that they
wine writer guests that
on.
I've had on the podcast before have all talked about that, the difficulty of maintaining a full-time salary from writing and having to find other sources of income.
Yeah, well, I was talking about this with some journalists the other day. We're all the same age, and a few people are just considering completely different careers because they don't know what the future is.
And that's the thing, like, it's something that I talked about a few episodes ago with Sue and Roger, when they made the switch to set up a website. Basically, it was like a free guide that, with the advent of websites and blogs and stuff like that, people expect to be able to go online and get content for free. They don't, what you mean I have to buy a restaurant guide? That's crazy.
Yeah, I think people have been spoiled a bit.
Yeah,
because,
more than a bit.
If you walk into a bookstore, you're happy to pay, $20, $30, sometimes $70, $100 for a book.
With beautiful photos in it, yeah.
But if you ask people to pay, $3 a week to read, I don't know, the Herald or the New York Times, they're like, oh, I'm just going to work out how to get around this. You know what I mean?
Well, there are some websites, from wine writers, wine experts, that have a subscription package. Do you know of any, restaurant reviewers or food writers that have that kind of model?
The closest I can think of is that you physically go out and buy a print edition of the Good Food Guide. And that has had app editions in the past. I think everyone's trying to figure it out, right? Everyone's been trying to figure it out for a long time.
So you'd been working in media for a while. What sort of media were you doing before you kind of got inspired with food?
So at the time, I was working on a magazine called Inside Out, which was mostly interiors. It was just something I fell into, and I was working my title was Deputy Chief Sub-Editor. So you have someone called the Chief Sub-Editor, and there's a joke that you only have that role once in your life because it's so stressful and thankless, because no one ever compliments you on getting your job done correctly. They always are ready to blast you for, oh my God, you got that typo on the front cover, or you forgot to put the barcode on, and now we have to spend all this money slapping barcode stickers on the front of, it's a really thankless task.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows when you get it wrong, but no one ever notices when you do it right.
Yeah.
So I was like the deputy to my chief sub-editor. And I think in a way, because it's quite, I wouldn't want to say menial task, but a lot of time you're just checking copy, and, I can spot 2 double spaces, from a kilometre away now because you're just proofing a lot of copy.
You're a kerning expert, are you?
Yeah, you're just cutting to fit. So it's quite like a methodical kind of nitty-gritty job. You can be a little creative with, headlines and intros and captions, but it's not hugely creative on on an expansive kind of basis.
So how
And
are
which,
you kind of, fueling your creative side?
well, I think like having that, like having a blog where I could write as much as I liked. You know, you didn't have, oh, well, you've got a word count of 300 words because we have to put pictures in and then that's how long the page is. It's like, oh, well, I can write something that's 2 sentences. I could write something that's, like I recently wrote something on the blog about Noma, Australia.
Yeah.
And without trying, it ended up being 5,000 words, which is longer than anything I even wrote at university. And I think it was kind of quite a personal take on what it was like to eat there and get such a panoramic view of the Australian landscape through these, 12 or so plates that ended up on your table. And also what it meant to have Noma come here and how it affected the dining scene, some of the debates that it kind of sparked about, like, how much should it really cost? Should we be paying this? No. And also...
why is that? Because they were sourcing a lot of, like, native ingredients?
Well, I think I totally get that $500 is a crazy huge amount of money to spend on one meal. That's a lot of money. And the way I see it, the way I justified spending that amount, because, it's a lot of money.
And that was just for food?
That was just for food. And then once you added drinks, like the wine match was about $200. And then the juice or the non-alcoholic match was about $90. And if you just had one tea, that was $10. So it wasn't a cheap meal. But the way I justified it was like, one, I don't know when I'll ever go to Copenhagen. That might never happen, and that's a very
come on. I think we all have to make that pilgrimage at one point. It's like going to Tokyo. You have to go to Tokyo. You have to go to Paris. For food.
Oh yeah, like Tokyo is amazing, but you can get $400 flights to Tokyo. You know what I mean?
True.
And I thought, you know what, that's the only other way to go to Noma, or I could spend $500 and eat Noma's version of Australian food in my own city. So in comparison, that is kind of a bargain. And also, it's a restaurant that only exists for 10 weeks. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try it. And I'm so fascinated by how Rene Redzepi and his team would translate what they do in this country with such a wealth of ingredients that even locals like us still don't fully understand. And, lastly, as I think I've mentioned a few times, and I've gotten a bit of shit for saying, for mentioning on my own podcast that I'm a vegetarian, but I am a vegetarian. And I remember being really inspired by an interview that Rene Redzepi did on Desert Island Discs, where he said, for a long time he thought of vegetables as garnishes, and then he realized they could be the lead guitarists of a dish. And I was really intrigued by how he would do a vegetarian degustation in Sydney with Australian ingredients.
Well, yeah, I mean, you don't have to tell me about vegetarianism because I live with one. And,
great.
It's and since we've been together, I've had to really think about the kind of places that we'd like to go and eat. And it's quite funny because some of the places in Melbourne that I really loved eating, one of the things that I loved about them was how they would champion vegetables on a dish. Yeah. And so I was like, this actually going to be quite easy as long as I can have a couple of meals a week where I do have my meat fix.
Yeah, so obviously I have the reverse where I go with my boyfriend and he eats meat. And I think we've been going out for almost a similar time of length to the blog, so coming up to 10 years.
Yep.
And if you asked us what are our favorite restaurants, they would all be the same restaurants.
Yeah. Exactly. Because they're the ones who are a lot more creative in the way they think about all food, whether it's, meat or vegetable or carbohydrates, whatever you want to label it. They're the ones who are actually going to look at any kind of ingredient and say, how can I best express this?
Yeah. And you know what? I'm also amazed. I can go to somewhere like LP's Quality Meats and eat something really amazing and it happens to be vegetarian, or even Bell's Hot Chicken, or, Waterman's Lobster Co. So I find that interesting that it has become a lot more accommodating.
What about Mary's?
Oh, Mary's has like one of the best vegetarian things you could eat in Sydney. Their shroom burger is incredible. And Jake from Mary's was a vegetarian for, I can't remember, maybe like 4 years, and he was a vegan for a little while as well.
Wow. What a
Yeah.
scoop. I did not know that.
Yeah, it's funny how many chefs used to be a vegetarian at some point because Ben Sears, who worked at, I think, Cutler and Co. in Melbourne and runs Moon Park in Sydney, he was a vegetarian as well.
Yeah. Well, that
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me. Like, particularly if you're into Korean food, like you can do pretty well. Even though everyone thinks of Korean food as like barbecue or fried chicken, that kind of thing, you can do really well on a vegetarian diet.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? In like what the almost 10 years me and my boyfriend have been going out, we've only disagreed about one place. Like one place out of the countless would have to be hundreds of places we've gone out to.
There you go. So, how did you kind of dive into the food blog? Was there much in the way of food blogging that at the time that was kind of good research for you, or did you just sort of throw yourself into it and say, "I'm going to write the way I want to write"?
Yeah, so I first heard about food blogs maybe a year or so before that in um, so the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, the union, they have a really good magazine called The Walkley, and just another reason why you should join your union, and it's tax deductible. There's my plug for the union. Besides, like them actually championing workers' rights and all that. But anyway, the magazine's really good, and I read an article about food blogs, and so that's how I found out about Grab Your Fork. So I think Helen Yee, who runs it, does a really great job. Has been doing it for more than 10 years. I'm guessing maybe like 12 or more. So I knew about that, but I knew that I really wanted to write, and I wanted to write in my own way, and I didn't want it to be that almost bullet point style of we tried this and it was delicious, and we tried that and it was delicious, and I just wanted to write in the way I did, and
You didn't
it
want
can be
people to
like,
basically look at the blog and say, "Well, I could get all that information just reading the menu. They say what the ingredients are. How does it make you feel?"
yeah, and I'm trying to think of some examples of you know how I've done this in the past. Like, this is a ridiculous example, but there was a place called The Dip that opened a few years ago, which is run by Andrew Levins, who is co-host of the Mitchin podcast, which is also something worth listening to if you're interested in
I'm
the
sure that there
Australian.
are plenty of my listeners who, again, listen to the Mitchin as well, because I think we are pretty much the premier three food and or wine podcasts in Australia.
I would also throw in Ingredipedia in there. I think that's
Okay.
quite a popular Australian
I
food
do see
podcast.
that. I do see that one on the charts, but I actually haven't had the opportunity to listen to it yet, and I'll have to dive into it.
So what's funny is someone on Twitter listened to Ingredipedia and they recommended my podcast in their podcast. So they listened to my one, The Unbearable Lives of Being Hungry, and at the end I recommended your podcast. So that person then listened to your podcast. So they
And then
kind
that
of
person ended up on the podcast.
yeah. So it's quite nice how that can
What's that?
happen.
That's only 4 degrees of separation.
Yeah. But I think there's definitely a feeling that we don't see each other as competition. We kind of see each other as, I think it's exciting that there are all these Australian food podcasts.
Well, I mean, the guys on the Mitchin have been on your podcast, and you've been on the Mitchin a few times.
Yeah. I think the more food podcasts in Australia, the better,
Yeah.
you know? So this is like a silly example, but I wrote, when I was writing about the dip, I said, choosing between, they had a dessert that's like an ice cold guacamole, which sounds weird, but actually was really delicious, and a cookies and cream dessert. And I said choosing between the two was like the dessert equivalent of Betty versus Veronica or Brooke versus Taylor on Bold and the Beautiful.
Wow.
And I just,
A lot
I
of people
just
would have said it's like Sophie's Choice, but that's probably a little bit too dark.
yeah. But I just thought, I just wanted to write something that was fun and accessible, and you didn't feel like you had to, sit through some, culinary degree to understand what I kind of feel it's a bit more like music writing, where you just throw in like just a lot of accessible, descriptions, or just make it fun.
So you like to include references, particularly if it's like pop culture, to keep it accessible for the reader?
Yeah, like I think I once, said something like a burger joint that was like the Coldplay of burgers, because it at the time was not that exciting. But most of the time I try to, because I don't have a lot of time to write as much as I'd like, I try to focus on places I do like.
Sure.
Yeah.
And did that kind of philosophy sort of lead you into the podcast as well, which of course has the same name?
Yeah. So I guess in a way that doing a food blog was a bit of a reaction against what is done in traditional media, where I can like blurt for 5,000 words about Noma Australia and not worry about, is it clickable, or what's the angle, or, what makes it so hot, or, why don't you keep it under 400 words, because no one's going to read more than that. The podcast was a bit like that, because I thought at the time, and this is 3 or so, maybe coming up to 4 years ago, there just wasn't a lot of coverage about chefs that was in-depth, and also not about the most high-profile chefs. Because you've probably read an in-depth interview with Jamie Oliver or Heston Blumenthal, or like the really, really big guys. But I wanted to shine a spotlight on local chefs or sommeliers or critics, and not get caught up on like, you should care about the chef because he or she is so hot right now. I'm just like, let's just tell their story and it'll be interesting. And some of the stories have been so insane and so amazing. Like, I interviewed a guy who I think a lot of people probably don't know by name. His name is Nick Smith. He runs a place called Rising Sun Workshop, which is about to open again in Sydney. It's a bit of an unusual concept. It's half ramen bar, half motorcycle workshop.
Okay.
And, yeah, exactly, right? And before that, I didn't know that much about him, except that I really liked going to this ramen place, and he used to work at Single Origin. There wasn't any coverage on him at all, pretty much. So I start the interview, and I usually start with, was food a big deal when you were growing up? And he starts to tell this story, and he says, besides the bomb scare when I was a kid, blah, 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 blah. And he keeps going on. And I'm like in my head going, what? He said bomb scare?
Just brush over that.
Yeah. So he like talks for a few more minutes, and then he finishes, and I go, when you said bomb scare, were you exaggerating, or did that actually happen? And he's like, no, that happened. And then tells this incredible story of, so he was quite young. I can't remember if he was 6 or 9 years old. And his mum was sick with the flu, so she was lying upstairs, in her nightgown. And he was watching TV, and he was like, I'm hungry. I need some food. You know what? I know how to cook. So he went to the cupboard and got some, I think, tinned spaghetti. And it's like, the way you cook is you just turn on the gas, and you just put the can directly on top of the flame. And that's what he did. And then he went to watch a TV show, completely forgot about this
Taking
can.
the lid off?
Yeah, no, the lid was not taken off. He didn't put it in a pan or anything. He just put this can directly on the flame. Forgot about it, and then, of course, at a certain point, the can explodes. It like shoots right through the roof, clean through the roof. There's this massive explosion sound. His neighbor, who used to be in the Israeli military, hears this sound and is like, that's a bomb. So he calls the bomb squad. The bomb squad turns up on his doorstep. His poor mum, who's just been lying upstairs sick, has no idea what's happening.
She didn't hear it? She didn't get woken up?
I don't know. I don't know how sick she was. He didn't mention it. And
Okay.
She comes downstairs in the nightgown and has to like answer these questions from the bomb squad. And then he got banned from cooking in the kitchen, but whenever his parents went out, he would just cook kind of secretively and then clean up. And then he eventually kind of became a stockbroker, just kind of by accident. My summer job kind of led to it being an accidental career. And he found that, there's a lot of like whining and dining of clients in that kind of work. And he said it was really depressing because you go to some really expensive restaurant with your client and you look over and the next table would be the clients that you wined and dined yesterday. And you look over at the other table and there'll be clients you wined and dined 3 days ago, but with like your rivals. And he was like, this is so silly. So what he ended up doing was inviting them back to his place and cooking for them. And then he ended up running a catering company out of his lounge room. And then he ended up at Single Origin. And it's like, wow, that was all from a bomb scare. Isn't that amazing?
Well, I find, I have to admit that one of the really amazing things about your podcast is that you clearly do a lot of research, which is not necessarily something that I do a lot of for my podcast. I like to just find out things about people organically. But I think that's the great thing about the format with that conversation is that someone, like if they're being asked very formed questions, they have their prepared answers, and you probably don't find out anything really exciting or new. But if you're just having a conversation, getting to know someone, you might head down, like we've been doing for, the last 40 minutes, you might head down a completely different path and start talking about something that you probably didn't think you'd discuss.
Yeah, for sure. And for instance, when I was talking to Chris Tay, who runs Black Star Pastry in Sydney, I was asking him about their second outlet, which is like beautiful and has this massive kind of copper-lined bench that just looks so expensive to make. It's beautifully designed, and I was just having a bit of a joke, and I said, "Oh, it looks like it was a bit of a pain in the butt to build and design." I said, "Well, actually," and he told this story about how it's a tribute to his mother who had cancer for a really long time. I think it was maybe 12 years.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, I feel really bad that I was just being a bit facetious.
Flippant,
but then I was just being like really silly. But then he ended up telling this like really beautiful story about how much that cafe was something that was in honor of his mother. So yeah, with a conversational format, you can end up in really unexpected places rather than knowing, oh no, I've only got 10 minutes and I need a great headline and a great quote to lead with. It's just, whatever happens. If it's really boring, I'll edit it out. But a lot of the time you just end up being gobsmacked by what people will tell you.
Well, you have had some episodes that you've had a really, really short period of time, and I guess they're with some of the slightly high-profile visiting chefs who are on a really tight schedule. People like Massimo Bottura and Ferran Adria. That must have been pretty amazing to have the opportunity to record an episode with them, but I guess pretty scary as far as the time pressures.
Yeah, so the Ferran Adria one was really funny because he was literally only in Sydney for one day, would have had so much press interest, and the only time they could slot me in was literally from when he left the airport to when he got to his hotel. So they're basically saying, can you get a ride with Ferran Adria and record your interview in that time? And of course you're going to say yes, because why would you turn down any opportunity to talk to him? But also, I was so stressed beforehand because I thought, well, what if his plane is delayed and that completely overshoots the schedule and I don't get a chance to talk to him? I'm meeting him in the airport, and you know how those things can go wrong. You're in the wrong part, or you can't get into the part he's in because you don't have a ticket. And, in the end, and also there was another level of complication because he had a translator with him. And I thought, oh, my God, what if I ask the question and when it gets translated, it ends up being really offensive, or he gets to take it. Like, for instance, I wanted to ask, there was an interview he did ages ago, I think with Esquire, where Ferran Adria talked about how he used to pump tomatoes full of air and blow them up. But that was just a punk phase he was going through. And I wanted to say, in your 50s, having run one of the world's best restaurants for so long, do you still see yourself as a punk? But I was worried, what if I say punk and the translator turns it to douchebag and he says, do you think you're a douchebag? Those things
you little punk.
Wrong. Yeah. But it just turns out the word for punk in Spanish is just punk with a Spanish accent. So we actually had a really fun interview, even though it was only 17 minutes. And then I found out from the press people that he apparently said it was one of his favorite interviews of the tour. So it was just really nice that, even though it was so short, that he got something out of it.
But and you probably would appreciate this, having worked in media and continuing to be a writer, and particularly as far as print media, that kind of thing, because you write for Good Food. One of the things that I like about the podcast format is that it's really just a moment in time. It's that specific conversation. So, I come out of it and I think, well, I could have asked about that, or we could have talked about that thing, but I appreciate what we've talked about now. I like the fact that people are just listening into a conversation, and it's not going through that rewriting process or that really heavy editing process. A lot of the time, things that I might take out are just, issues with the recording, and that's it. You want to feel free flowing and again, conversational. That's certainly one of the things that I like about listening to your podcast. And the Mitchin is, another great example. It's just a conversation between a group of people.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say. And yes, it's just all about the way it flows. Like, even with Dan Barber, originally I had half an hour. I was so excited, like half an hour of Dan Barber. But then there was a TV crew before me and they kept eating into my time. And I think in the end I ended up with 14 minutes and I had to ditch half my questions, and he had to go straight after. So there was no kind of give with that. But I remember asking him about, because he grows his own wheat. It's called Barber wheat.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know,
I've seen it on Chef's Table.
Yeah. I wanted to well, why go to that trouble? What makes it different to other wheat? And he gave this quite technical answer about bushels per yield. And I just thought, the average person, it's just not gonna get through to them. So I just facetiously said, oh, well, if you're not a wheat nerd, what does that actually mean? And then he said, are you calling me a wheat nerd? And then he had a laugh. And I was like, phew, he thought it was funny. He wasn't offended. He had a laugh and he said, and he gave such a great answer. He said, you know what? It doesn't slap you in the face like a glass of wine, but it reminds you that wheat is a grass and it actually tastes of something.
Yeah.
And so much of the time we make wheat white, we remove anything from it. There's just nothing there. So, I don't think many people would call Dan Barber a wheat nerd. I feel like having a podcast, you just have that flexibility to just, be a bit silly, or, what, I don't mind if I say something and it makes me look like a bit of a goose, because if he gives a great answer, that's the more important thing.
But I think that and again, it's the same as far as wine and food and restaurants, that kind of thing. You would probably think that most people perceive people who are really into that kind of thing as being really into the technicality and the specifics, and they get, as you say, a bit nerdy about stuff. But what I like about doing the Vincast, and I'm sure it's the same thing with you, same thing with Mitchin, is that it's making people realize that, look, we're just normal people. We're really passionate about this, but we don't talk about it possibly in the way that you think we do. It's not that really deep, meditative kind of conversation. It's just, hey, we make references, pop culture references to restaurants or to wines or food in the same way that you do. So I think that conversational element really allows people to kind of go, oh, cool, these are just normal people and they just happen to be chefs or they happen to be winemakers.
Yeah, you're just trying to connect people to ideas or concepts in a way that translates, right? I remember when I was working at Inside Out, I had a Q&A with a sommelier from, I think it was Must Wine Bar in Perth.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, what should people try? This was a few years ago. And he said, people should try a Vouvray because, if you like the Granny Smith kind of that crispness of biting into a Granny Smith apple, I think you'll like Vouvray. And I thought that's such a nice, direct way to explain what it tastes like. If you don't know anything about wine, you can already taste the flavor of the Vouvray from this description. And he also had another great line about, because I said, what do you like to drink after service, like beer or wine, etc. And he said, sometimes you want to be the bug that gets smashed on the windscreen, and sometimes you want to be the windscreen. And I don't fully understand what he meant, but I kind of also do. And I just thought that was a great way to, express that feeling.
I think it's the difference between drinking a beer or drinking a Fernet Branca.
Yeah, right. Okay. And I mean, isn't the thing like with sommeliers, it's just all about communication and connection. Like if you can connect a diner to something that they might like through your extensive knowledge, you've done your job.
Yeah. And that is sort of one of the more complicated things about working in that environment. I guess it's one of the interesting things that's happened with dining more recently. I guess it's part of that the whole MasterChef thing, where you've got open kitchens and you've got chefs actually, serving, on a bar, for example, and actually they are talking through the dish rather than having, the wait staff actually explaining the dish. So I think there's this new level of engagement for the diner with the person that's actually putting together a dish.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a big part of why that Noma Australia pop-up really connected to people. Like you would have, say, Bo Clugston, who was the sous chef, and, he's from Coffs Harbour in New South Wales, but has been in Copenhagen for 8 years. And, he'd bring out a dish, and there was a schnitzel dish, which is usually abalone, but I had a shiitake version. And around it is like a ring of all these amazing condiments that they basically forage. A lot of it that you would walk past on the beach, you wouldn't even realize you could eat. And there's something called a bunyana. And he said, oh, you know what? This bunyana, or the bunyana, goes back to the dinosaur age. And it's so hard to harvest. Like sometimes it takes 5 years to successively harvest bunya nuts. That Aborigines would have bunya nut parties when they finally could get their bunya nuts to grow. And that's such an evocative story. And it really said a lot to me about the Australian landscape, how old this ingredient is, even though I felt like I had never tried it before, and also something about Indigenous culture. And I was talking to another chef about it. I thought, that's why I really loved the Noma Australia experience, because it really made me think about the landscape and the history of this country. And this chef said, oh, well, Ben Shirley's been serving bunya nuts for a long time now. And he kind of took it as some kind of dig at Australian chefs, because Australian chefs have been using a lot of native produce and not getting the big spotlight. But I don't think that's how you should take it, because, I've been to Attica and it's amazing. But if you don't explain to someone, this is the story of the bunya nut, on the plate to them, it's just another nut.
Mm.
And that's, I think, the power of, telling the story, getting the colour, getting the history,
So, Lee Tran, I'm actually going to finish our discussion today the way that you start your podcasts. And I'm going to ask you, was food important when you were growing up?
I think I was a little bit of a brat, and I didn't realise how great it was at the time. I grew up, my parents, they're from Vietnam, but their parents from China. And I grew up with what I now look back on and think is amazing food. But at the time, I was, such a little brat. And I was like, oh, why can't I have McDonald's? So, we grew up with custard apples and dragon fruit and rambutans and, all these amazing Asian tropical fruits. And, I didn't love having durian birthday cakes because they're pretty stinky, but, that's all food now.
I was listening to your most recent episode and I was thinking, oh, that's right. When I was staying in Singapore in a hostel, they said there was a sign up saying, don't bring durian into the hostel.
Because it's so funky and such an assault on your nose.
Very, very, very strong.
Yeah. So, I grew up, eating pho with my parents in these cheap and cheery Cabramatta eateries, or, having broken rice and steak. And, I wish I had appreciated it, because now that is cool. But at the time, Cabramatta was not a cool place to grow up in. When it got a KFC, we're like, oh my God, it got a KFC. But nowadays people are like, oh, it's cool because it doesn't have a KFC. It's cool because
or if a KFC does open, you say, oh, there goes the neighborhood.
Yeah, totally. So I wish I had known how well I had it, instead of just wishing for, as a kid, everyone just wants junk food that's marketed to you. So it was a big deal without me realizing it.
Well, it must have kind of seeped into your being in some way for you to dedicate yourself to food and to dining and to still enjoy it. But I really do appreciate you jumping online today and sharing your story. And I think it's more about a conversation, I guess, really. But thank you for being on the Vincast.
Oh, no, thank you. It's been such a huge pleasure. And thank you for doing what you do. I think it's such a great way to document what people are doing across the country. And, I think James Hurd, who's now doing wine at the Dolphin in Sydney, says wine is pretty much about people and place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so what you're doing is pretty much about people and place.
Well, I think it's the same thing with the food as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what it really comes down to.
Lee Tran, if people would like to follow what you do, would you possibly be able to share various website addresses, social medias, and where they can find the Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I do a blog and a podcast with the same name, which is annoyingly long to type, but it is the Unbearable Lightness of Being Hungry.com. And so that's got links to blog posts and podcasts. You can download the podcast on iTunes, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Lee Tran Lam, which is all one word, which is LEETRANLAM. There you go.
And guys, just as I do encourage you with the Vincast, do go and subscribe on iTunes to Lee Tran Lam's podcast, and 5 stars and a lovely review, please.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lee Tran. Thank you very much, as always, for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and of course, thank you so much to Lee Tran Lam for being on this week's episode. You can follow me on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm under the Intrepid Wino handle. Please follow me or hit that like button and check out some of the content that I share there. I'd love for you to come and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's also under Intrepid Wino. That's where I do videos, particularly like Let's Taste, where I open up Australian wines and share my impressions of them. Why not hit a couple of like buttons or leave a comment there? I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on any kind of platform that you might use, like iTunes, Player FM, or Stitcher, because subscribing means that you get the newest episode as soon as it becomes available. And if you are subscribing, please do leave a 5-star rating and a review for the podcast, because it's a great way to provide feedback to me, but also to provide feedback to potential listeners and, more importantly, potential guests who you might want to listen to on the show. Come and visit me at intrepidwino.com. You'll find lots of information about myself and about my background and my journey through wine. And also, I'd love for you to hear from you on email. So hit me up at thevincast@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. But until next time, bye.